apple basket with swing handle remains a favorite of mine. I have loved handwork since I was a girl, and my earliest baskets, simple coiled pieces, were made in 1975. My husband, Scott Gilbert, and I were inspired by Sue Stevenson's book, Basketry of the Appalachian Mountains, when we started learning white oak, and Scott made me a lidded sewing basket using similar construction techniques to the apple basket. In the early 1980s, Scott and I studied with Ollie and Lestel Childress of Park City, Kentucky, and truly learned about white oak. And although most of the baskets that we made were rib style, Ollie made beautiful flower baskets that started with wide spokes, which she would narrow as she continued up the sides of the basket. I love the simplicity of the apple basket and the design. I especially like that white oak handle that's made in our shop in Allen County. This is an easy basket to make, and once you master a few techniques, I think you'll enjoy weaving a variety of spoke construction baskets. So first we'll take a look at tools and materials, then we'll lay out the base. Next we'll be weaving up the sides, and finally attach the handle and the rims. The apple basket is made with reed, a material that's cut from the rattan palm vine, and it's available in a variety of sizes and shapes. To make it flexible when you work with it, you want to soak it in some warm water, and depending on the size and thickness of the material, that's what determines the length of time of soaking. So with the flat material, I usually start with a couple of minutes in warm water, up to about 10 minutes for that heavier weight outside rim. And when you get ready to store the material away, be sure that it's completely dry and do not store it in plastic. After you soak your flat reed, you want to determine which is the smooth and which is the rough side. So typically I'll take it and bend it over my thumb, and I'll just see if I can rough up that side of it. And you can see some fraying going on. I do like to check the opposite side as well, and it's a bit smoother. Sometimes the rough side will reveal itself more as a graininess rather than fraying, but you do want to check every piece before you put it into your basket. To get started, I sort through my 1/4 inch material, and I find a couple of really flexible pieces that are nice and long, and I save those for the end to do the lashing. I also like a nice flexible piece to start my basket, so I set those aside, and I cut 16 pieces from the 1/2 inch flat reed that are 27 inches long, and each one of those pieces I determine the smooth versus the rough side, and this is my smooth side on the inside here, and I simply mark that with a pencil on each one of those. Now I'm ready to start the basket, and I select 8 spokes. One of the spokes, I take it and cut it right up the center. This will give us an odd number of spokes. We're going to do a continuous weave on the apple basket. And if you notice, these 2 spokes then are going to be half the width of the others. So I don't like to put any of my joins or overlaps along these spokes. I kind of treat them as a little bit of a tender spot. And I just cut that up to, about 1 inch from my center mark here. Next, we're going to lay out the base. And I want to start with this split spoke. And as I add all the spokes in, I will just cross them on their centers. And again, these are all smooth side up. So we continue to add. This is the 3rd spoke, and it bisects that area. fourth spoke. The fifth spoke is going to lay here. These are smooth side up and my centers are marked. And spoke number 7 will come here to the right hand side of the split. And spoke 8 to the left hand side. Now what's going to happen as you weave around this first row is that the spokes will want to move as you're working around that first row. So when your stitch gets to a spoke, just adjust the spokes as you go before you lay that stitch in. We're working with the smooth side of the spoke, so we also want to work with the smooth side of the weaver. And I'll place this weaver in between the split. And if I leave a tail that's 3 or 4 inches long, I can simply lay that tail right on top of spoke 8. And if I want to, I can even clip it just until I get back around. Perhaps I want to tighten up this beginning just a little bit so the weaver is pulled up against the edge of the spoke. And I will turn the weaver up on its edge, which allows the weaver to flow and come more evenly underneath that next spoke. Now what I see here is a tighter space, a more open space, so I'm going to adjust the spoke and then push the weaver up into it. To keep the work in front of me, I'll simply press down and rotate the spokes around. And now I'm ready to turn the weaver up on its edge, kind of support it here with my finger. Again, adjust that spoke if need be, and bring the weaver up to the spokes. Press and rotate. And I want to go around one complete time until I'm back to the split. I'm catching the tail of the weaver as I come across spoke number 8. I'm adjusting the spokes before placing the weaver. And I'd like this first round to be as much of a circle as I can make it. When I get back to the split, I separate out and create more space between that split. And I just take a look at my first row. If I want to tighten it up just a bit, I can adjust, pull the start in, and push the weaver a little bit tighter. So I'm happy with that shape, and I'll just continue around each row, turning the weaver on its side. Until I've gone about 8 rows. After I weave over this tail with the second weaver, I'll go in and trim that back. And continue on. As you weave around building your basket, eventually your weaver is going to come to an end and you need to add another one. So I'm going to show you how to do that at this point. One reason I want to do it now is because I want to do it so that the weaver will be long enough to catch 2 rows when we do the next step of adding the spokes. This weaver is coming to an end. I want to follow it along. And if it was a little bit longer and it wanted to join across that split spoke, I would cut it back some. And you want to take your scissors and trim the old end away at the edge of the spoke so that it goes across that whole length. And then check to see if your spokes are smooth side up or rough side up at this point, and they're smooth side up. So I want to join this weaver smooth side up as well. And the join goes back across 4 spokes. And I just lap the new weaver right on top of the old. I can push this forward so it's just long enough that again it will come to the edge of the spoke here. You could use a clip or a clothespin to hold this until you get around one more time if you wanted to. So let's do that. And I'm going to continue to weave. Now let's see how we count these rows right here at the split. This is where the first row started, and so as it finishes I count that as 1. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We want to go one more round before we add in the other 8 spokes. The weavers kind of cup up on their side a little bit, and that's just the nature of this particular construction. You've got a flat material and you're weaving it into a circle. This completes the 8th row, and we're also checking that we are on a row where the weaver is underneath the right hand side of the split, and that means that when we weave over the new spoke, we'll be holding that new spoke in place. So I line a new spoke, weave over the new and under the old, press the weaver up tight against the previous row, and lay in the next new spoke. You want to kind of align the spoke right where you're weaving, as well as across the center and into its space on the opposite side. At this point, we'll be adding in all 8 remaining spokes over the new and under the old. You may notice in your weaving that all of a sudden, when you look at the relationship of this row to the previous row, it appears that the previous row stitch is weaving over 3 of your spokes. That's just the nature of adding spokes to this basket. Continue on around until you've woven in both ends of these last spokes. We refer to this as a double bottom. So in essence, what we're doing is starting that second bottom with the addition of the final 8 spokes. Try to center those spokes in the space as you go. Those spokes can get a little crisscrossed, so just check that you're straightening them out as you go. I think that looks just beautiful. with those spokes laid in there. So you want to continue around one more complete row, and the next step will be to shape the base. The basket has a raised base or a hump in the center of it to the inside. So one more complete round, coming back to the split and just a couple of stitches beyond. If your weaver dries out while you're working, you can just spritz it a bit. Typically, I don't spray and re-wet the entire base, the part that's already woven. Make some little adjustments as you go. So already you're beginning to think about the space that you have between your spokes, and you want it to be as even as possible all the way around. So we want to come just a couple stitches past the slit. And with the added spokes woven in with 2 complete rows, we're ready for the next step. The added spokes are locked in place with 2 rows of weaving, and it's time to create the hump on the inside of the basket. So we'll take these added spokes and flip them over and place that right on your knee, and you want to press down, rotate and press down, and you're creating a cone shape in making this raised base. You may notice that some of these rows are loosening up a bit, and at this point, if you'd like to, you can take a packing tool and go back a couple of rows and work those stitches forward. I believe with this one, I'm just going to go on with it here. I like to weave on the side opposite myself, and as I continue to weave, I'm going to stay on my knee for a couple of rows, and the split spoke helps me identify that. I am increasing the tension of the weaver, pulling it tight to help set the shape. So I just rotate the basket around, push the previous rows up a bit if I need to. Keep the tension tight as I work around. I'm getting close to the split, so I've almost completed one round. Maybe tighten up these previous rows here by pushing them up toward the center. You can use your fingertips or a packing tool to do that. So I've completed one round. Back to the split. One more round, and I can see that I'm going to need a new weaver before I get around the second time. I'm working on the inside of the basket now, and that means I've got the rough side of the material up. So when I splice in my new weaver here, I'll need to turn the weaver with the rough side up. Again, I want to trim the weaver at the edge of the spoke. Check my new weaver. Smooth versus rough. It's going to be a 4-spoke overlap, so I like to come in on top of that second spoke back and then just judge the length that that weaver needs to be before tucking it underneath the spoke. And continue on. Remembering that I'm keeping some tension on this weaver as I go around on my knee. So I'll come to the split. That completes my second round. And I'll just go a couple of stitches past the split. Now let's check it and see if the base is pretty well set. We can look underneath, and you want to see that your spokes are holding the shape up there. And we want to check it on the table too. So let's put this back on the table. Spread the spokes out. Press the base downward. And the basket should hold its shape. If it doesn't, you can put it back on your knee, shape it a little bit more, and go another round or two, increasing the tension. I would say that base is maybe about 3 inches tall. So your base could be holding its shape and be firm even if it was a little bit shorter or a bit taller. These shapes of the base will vary from one weaver to another. Our next job is just to continue weaving as the base flattens out here until the basket measures about 10 inches in diameter. So holding the basket on the table, continue to weave. And you don't want to press down really hard in the center. You're more just holding and supporting it as you weave around. Adjusting those spokes a little bit if you need to. So we're beginning to look at the space between all of the spokes and evening it out as we continue to weave. The double bottom and the raised base makes this a really strong basket. That way you can carry a lot of weight in it, and the weight is evenly distributed around the edge of the base. I continued to weave around until the basket is about 10 inches in diameter. And this is the point where I want to start bringing the sides of the spokes up and creating that really nice rounded base. So I'll take a spray bottle, and at the edge of the base, I'll spray the spokes. And I like to flip over and spray the underside as well. And once the spokes have time to absorb that water a bit, I'm just going to roll each one with my thumb just to get it accustomed to coming up as opposed to laying flat. So I go around each and every spoke and roll it upward. I'm stretching the fibers out a little bit. making it easier for the spoke to turn up right at the edge of that base. We're not putting a hard crease in these spokes, we're just stretching the fibers out a bit. The next step is to cradle the basket and bring those spokes on up. And we're going to do this by holding it in our arms as well as increasing the tension on the weaver. And I like to weave with the weaver opposite of myself, so I'll just bring the basket up into my arms, hold the spokes against me, and press this down in. Maybe turn it a bit more to get started. As I continue to weave, I will keep tension on that weaver to help bring the spokes up. And it usually takes about 2 or 3 rounds of tension. And again, I can use my split spoke as my marker. Keep that tension. I really love this rounded shape, the base of the basket. So I've gone around once. And again, I want to take 2 or 3 times around, keeping the tension. I'm just checking over here that I'm allowing the spokes to roll up at the edge of the base and not putting a lot of pressure on them and having the basket to turn up back in this area. And I'm back to the split for round 2, but my end is not long enough to go over 4 spokes without including the split, so I'm going to cut this weaver here and splice on another one. So I've trimmed the end of the old weaver here. Again, I'm checking that I've rough side up on the material, overlapping on 2 spokes, adjusting the length so that this end fits right under that spoke. And I might want to put a clip on here because I'm putting extra tension and cradling still. A clip will help hold that. Clips or clothespins. And right back to the cradling. I've gone a couple of rounds with cradling, and probably go a couple more before I check and see that the sides of the base are rounding upward. Keeping tension on the weaver, holding those spokes up as I come around. Happy that I've already made it around twice. Just got a couple more rounds to go. Continue on until I've done this for 4 rounds. I'm coming around and finishing up my 4th round. Getting some good tension here. Coming a couple of stitches past my split spoke. And now I'm going to lay the basket on the table for the next step. So let's try to see what kind of tension that we've had. I'm just going to go around and gently press down. I can also press up from the outside all the way around a couple of times. I want the basket to turn up evenly all the way around. I've got a stitch that's a little bit loose here, so I can work it around just a bit. Tighten it up. Again, I can use my fingers or I can use a packing tool. I'm going to come on around. And before I continue weaving, I'm going to make a guide with my inside rim, and that guide will help me to get the size that I want at the top, which is 12 inches, so that the 12-inch swing handle will fit. To create the guide, I'll take the inside rim material, which is 1/2 inch wide, and it's flat oval, flat on the back and slightly rounded on the front side. And I want to shape it with the flat side out. So the material's been soaked, probably about 10 minutes, and I want to work out some of the stiffness just by going down to the end of the piece and coming back. If your piece of 1/2 inch flat oval is a little stiffer than this, you might have to soak it a bit more or maybe work it a bit more, but the goal is to get the stiffness out so that we can create a 12-inch diameter circle. And I like to measure this east and west, pull it on in, and measure it north and south too. So I think we're pretty close. And this piece was probably maybe about 4 feet long or a little bit shorter. You just want to be sure you're not cutting it to the exact length that you need it for the final inside rim. I'm just doing an overlap here, a couple of cable ties or twist ties, and take another measurement. The handle we're using for the apple basket is 12 inches, so we'd like for the top of the basket to be 12 inches as well. And I do like to put myself a mark in case this slips. I'll know right where to set it back. And I use this as a guide. And I can see that I need to bring my basket out a little bit and then probably straight up. Now at this point, your basket may be narrower than mine, and the guide, again, it helps to tell you how to angle those spokes as you continue to weave. So let's weave a couple more rows. I'm paying careful attention to the space between spokes at this point. I want those spokes to angle straight up the sides. And I could tell by the guide that I need to bring the weaving out. I've woven another couple rounds, and it's time to put a new weaver in, and I'm going to be right across that split, so I'll just cut the old end back. And now we are on the smooth side of the basket. I want to be sure and determine the smooth side on this weaver when I'm putting it in. Overlap on 1 and 2, pull the piece forward, get it to position, and overlap. I know I need to open this basket up a bit, so I'm making sure not to pull tight. You can see how those spokes will come in. So if your basket is a little bit large, what you'll want to do to bring it in is to increase the tension just a bit. I'm adjusting the spokes as I go around, aiming for as even a space between spokes as I can. Pull outward on the spokes to keep that basket open. Adjust the spokes to keep the space between the spokes even. So I've gone around about 2.5 times since I made my guide, and I want to put this right back on the table and check and see where we are. And place the guide inside. And I like to look right down at the center, and I can see that I need to still bring my basket out a little bit. Let's talk about the profile of the basket. Turn it around so you can see it. One thing I really like about this basket is this nice rounded curve on the bottom. And so again, your spokes may be coming up a little bit straighter depending on how the turn up of the basket was right here around the edge of the spokes. Or your basket may be a little bit broader and you may be needing to bring it in at this point. Just adjust the tension of the weavers and adjust the spokes as you go. If your spokes have really dried out, you can spray them with water. I would just spray from the weaving up, not re-wet the part of the basket that's already woven. I also like to use the guide to help hold the basket in shape. So if I was going to set the basket down and work on it at a different time, I would just put the guide under it like this. Look down into the center, make sure everything looks nice and even, and let it sit that way. That helps train those spokes where you want them to go. I'm going to continue weaving every 3 or 4 rows. I'm going to check with the guide on the inside of the basket until the basket gets to be about 6.5 inches tall, and that will give us about 2 inches of spoke above the weaving to do our next step. So I've gone almost 3 more rounds, and I think I'm ready to check with the guide again. Maintaining that equal distance between spokes, and on my basket keeping the weaving fairly loose so that my basket continues to open up. Now let's just check with the guide. I'm going to continue weaving until I get near one of my shortest spokes, and I want to have about 2 inches of space remaining on one of the shorter spokes, and then I'm ready to do the packing. The end of my weaver, I'm just going to leave it. I may add on to it later, I may cut it back, but for right now I'm just going to leave it. Let's stick it over here, and arbitrarily I'll put a pin on one of the spokes, pick up my packing tool, and starting here near the base, I'll just work across 3 or 4 spokes at a time using the fingers and the packing tool, and I will just work those weavers down toward the base and pack the basket. Get the weavers as tight as I can. Yours may be a little tighter or a little bit looser, and I like to just go ahead and come all the way up to the top row. Then I'm going to turn the basket and work across the next 3 or 4 spokes. And I'll do this all the way around back to my mark. So this is my shortest spoke that I have 2 inches remaining, and I just want to mark that for myself as I come back. I can remove this clip here, and I want to see what the height of my basket is right there on that shortest spoke. Let me get this weaver out of the way. So the basket height is right at 6 inches, or pretty darn close. And I want to go around a few spots on my basket and see that the height is 6 inches. So it looks about the same there. Turn on around. We're right at 6. And if you're not, then just go ahead and put a slight pencil mark on that spoke for you to mark this height. 6 inches. We're trying to level up that top row as much as possible and taper off this end. Right here we're about 6 inches. 6 inches. So as we're coming into it, just past the spoke that I marked, we'll need to taper the weaver down and leave it behind a couple of spokes right here. So the overall length would be a couple of inches past my mark. I'm going to unweave a few stitches. Spray this nice and wet and flexible. Just going to do a long taper from practically thread width all the way back over 5 or 6 inches to get to the full 1/4 inch width. And I want that just as gradual as I can make it. Now I'll weave this tapered end, weave this tapered end back into it, and leave the last couple of stitches behind spokes there. And I like to take my twist tie or cable tie and just mark this area where the taper remains behind the spokes. This mark will remind me when I'm lashing to run my lashing stitch under here and under there to secure the end of that taper. The top row that will be covered by the rim is 3/8 of an inch wide. And again, I'll just run the smooth side out. And I'm going to start this rim row where the taper ends by finding the last stitch that's on the outside of the spoke and putting my rim row behind that. And all the way around, just plain weave. This material is 3/8 of an inch wide, which is slightly narrower than the rim material, which is 1/2 inch wide. This one row is an independent row. It's going to finish off on itself. We go all the way around, and as you notice, this row is weaving opposite of the top row of 1/4 inch flat. So I'm back around to the beginning, and I'm simply going to do an overlap, but I need to go on the outside of 2 adjacent spokes so that I can go behind and overlap this piece on itself. I'll trim it to right here, just to the edge of the spoke, and place this tail behind the spoke to do the overlap. The next step is soaking these spokes at the top so that we can do the tuck over. I've been soaking the spokes, the top of the basket, for probably about 5 minutes in some warm water. And now we're ready to tuck them over and down into the basket. The spokes that will be tucked over are these spokes, where they are on the outside of that top row of weaving. So it's every other spoke. And I'm simply going to go around, make sure the top row is tight. I'm going to crease this spoke down as tightly as I can against that top row. So make sure the top row is pushed downward and crease the spoke. And I go around the entire basket, and every spoke that needs to be creased, I'll do so. When we come to the overlap of that top row, we have 2 spokes that are on the inside, and they'll just remain there. The next spoke that will be tucked is this one. Continue that all the way around. And that's a little cracky there. Maybe a bit of a split. We can sand that off later. All of this tucking, creasing area will be covered up by the rim filler. And again, this top row is going to be covered inside and out by the rims. Once every one of the stakes has been creased over, we want to mark where they need to be cut in order to tuck them on the inside. So let's look at the inside of the basket. This is one of the spokes that will be tucked to the inside, and I want to tuck it over this wide rim row and under 2 rows of weaving. So the first thing I need to do is mark it so I know the length that it needs to be. So I've marked that at the bottom of that second row, and I'll go around and mark every spoke in that fashion. Once all the spokes are marked, I'm going to go around and trim them. And I usually trim all of them around the basket, and then I go back and tuck them. So I can use this packing tool to pull out the 2 rows and roll the spoke down in. If you have a little bit of fraying, you can trim that off after you've tucked. And the spokes that are in between the tucked spokes, they simply get cut off, and you want to cut them off as flush to the top edge of the basket as you can. And continue this all the way around the top of the basket. The handle for the apple basket is a 12-inch white oak swing handle, handcrafted in our shop in Allen County, Kentucky. You have the handle and ears, and the ears have notches here for the inside and outside rims to fit in. The legs of the ears will be slipped down along the side of the basket. So your next job is to figure out where you want to attach the handle to the basket, what spokes you want these legs to fit upon. We want to choose the spokes to mount the handle on either side, and if I can, I like to choose a spoke that has been cut off flush at the top. There's just a little less bulk there, and with the profile of the ear, you have a lot of thickness in this area. So I simply slip this over the basket, follow that spoke across the bottom and up the other side, slip it in on this side, and I want to check how the handle lays around the side of the basket, if it lays right on the rim or just outside the rim. And when I flip it, I'd like to have that same distance on the opposite side. And if that doesn't suit me, I will just scoop this on around and make another test run. And once I'm happy with the position of the handle, I'd like to take my pencil and give myself a little mark on those spokes that I've chosen. A little check mark, a little smiley face on both sides. So let's take a look at the profile of the ear. You see that it's thick here where the notch is, and then tapers down. So it's this tapered end that we want to work behind a few rows of weaving, and we have to put it behind weaving on the outside of the basket as well as on the inside. So again, I'll just temporarily slip it over. When the handle's finally in place, the lower edge of the notch here would be level with the bottom of this top rim row. And as I look down the side of the ear, I see that I will probably begin pushing the ear under the weaver, let's say here. Again, it's away from the thickness part of the ear here. So if I count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weavers down, and I'll just start on the outside, raise the weaver and slip 1/4 of an inch worth under. Now I need to turn to the inside, and I'll pinch this leg together and slip underneath one row on the inside. If the basket is good and dry on the sides, these ears slip into place a lot more easily. Again, one move on the outside and one on the inside. Sometimes I can get it right in place or reach through from the outside. Back it out just a bit. There's an overlap there on my weaver, so that makes my job a little bit tougher. And push it right into place. So now this side is in place, and I'll do the same on the opposite side. Go ahead and soak your inside rim and outside rim and rim filler in some warm water for about 10 minutes. And While you're doing that, let's measure around the top row and find the circumference of your basket. So whatever the circumference, you're going to add some length to that for each of your rim pieces. The outside rim is going to be cut 4 to 6 inches longer than your circumference, and I've already marked these. The inside rim, which is flat oval, is cut about an inch or so shorter than the overall length of the outside rim. And the rim filler, which is number 6 round, is cut to the same length as that inside rim. And these have already been soaked. Each one of these pieces, you want to get rid of some of the stiffness by working them down their length. You can just work the pieces down and back to loosen them up a bit. They're just going to fit more easily around the top of your basket, cooperate a little bit better if you can get some of the stiffness out. If your pieces are really stiff, you might have to soak them just a little bit longer. And just temporarily clip that together. The inside rim piece will need to be worked a little bit more. This is made from your guide that you made earlier to help you size your basket. It's turned with the flat side out. I usually just work it a little bit more. And the outside piece is 1/2 inch half round and takes a little bit more working to get the stiffness out of it. It's a heavier weight material than the 1/2 inch flat oval inside rim. So we just want to work it down and back, warm it up a little bit, get some of the stiffness out of it. And I would just continue to work this outside rim until it'll lay in a nice circle for us. And with this piece, as you see, the flat side is to the inside. And our next step is to pin the inside and outside rim around the top of the basket and determine the length where the overlap or the join of these two ends is going to be. To begin with, I want to start in the center. I've got about equal length of rim to either side, and I don't care where on the basket I start this. Once I scarf the rims and put them back on the basket for the final time, I do care where the scarf joint is, but for now, I don't. At the same time, I'm going to find the center of the inside rim, place it right here. And about every 3 or 4 fingers worth, I'm going to pin the rims as tight up against the side of the basket as I can, working all the way around. You can see a little bit of space here around the ears, and that's just because of the profile of the ear where the notches are, just the nature of this basket. Now I'll go back to center and work myself around in the opposite direction. Use lots of clothespins. This just assures a really nice tight fit of your rims around the top of the basket. And let me show you how the rim just slips right into the notch, both the inside and the outside. And we come on around to the overlap. And I'm just going to check the length of the overlaps. The outside rim overlap looks like it's about 5 inches or so. I can check and see. Yeah. So you could do about a 4 to 5 inch overlap is good. I think I'll leave it that long. It could be a bit shorter. The inside rim is really longer than it needs to be. So at this point, I'm just going to cut it back so that it's about 4.5 to 5 inches. And now I'm ready to mark both ends of both rims to indicate where they overlap. The first mark is pretty easy to make. It's going to be right here at the edge. And I'll be carving away from that pencil mark down, carving away on the rounded side of this end of the rim. And next we'll mark the flat side of the opposite end. And in the same manner, we'll be carving away the flat side of this end of the rim. And you want to mark your inside rim the same way. The rounded side of one end and the flat side of the other. Now we'll take these rims off, set them aside. And we'll pin the rim filler around. The rim filler goes through the ears. It rides right up on the top edge of the basket. Again, we'll start in the center and just about every 3 or 4 fingers width. Pin this around. I like a much shorter overlap on the rim filler, just a couple of inches. So I'll trim this back to about a 2-inch overlap. And when I mark the overlap, I want to mark it so that the filler overlaps one piece on top of the other piece, as opposed to one piece in front and one piece behind. I want to mark it on top. And I think maybe that's a little bit longer than it needs to be. Trim it back a bit more. Okay. So I put a mark on the top side where that end is, and on the bottom side of the opposite end. And I'll remove this filler, and our next step is going to be to carve these overlapped areas on the outside rim, the inside rim, and the rim filler. And for that we'll be using a hand plane. I'm going to use a hand plane to scarf the rims, and I've got a shaving pony set up for my clamp. If you don't have that, you can simply use a board and lay your rim material on your board and hold it like this as you do the scarf joint. Go ahead and place mine. Be sure to bring the end of your rim all the way to the end of the board and lock it in place. Here's the mark where the overlap was, so I'm going to make my first cut from that mark forward. And I'm just taking off a sliver. I'll repeat that same motion, but with this stroke I want to start an inch or so closer to the end of my rim. And I'll repeat that again, and again. Now let's look at the thickness of the end of the rim. I think you can see that. We want this end to be about the thickness of a piece of flat reed, and we want this joint to taper from the mark all the way to that end. So I'm going to repeat what I've done. Just kind of look at that profile and go at it again. Take another look. We're still a bit thick here on the end. I want to be careful and not take off too much of the material in that area. Just about feather it out on the end, actually. Now let's work on the opposite end and see where we are. Bring the end of the rim all the way to the end of the board before locking it down. Start at the mark. This time we're working on the flat side. With each stroke, move closer to the rim's end. Check out the profile. This end should be about the thickness of the flat reed as well. So we've got a bit of work to do here. You can even almost just feather that very end out. All right, let's take a look. It's those carved surfaces that touch each other. And that looks like a pretty decent overlap. Ultimately, this thickness would be the same as the thickness of the rim anywhere else. A final step is to simply round this end out. Get rid of that blunt edge. And I would pin this rim together and allow it to dry before we do some sanding on it and put it on the basket. You're going to do a scarf joint on the inside rim as well and on the rim filler. The rims are going to fit right over this top wide row, and the next thing you want to do is get your cable ties and go around about every 4 or 5 spaces and insert a cable tie underneath that top row. And then the basket will be ready for the rims. As far as getting the rims ready, they're dry now and shaped, and we're going to do some sanding. Check this end here. If you need to do a bit more trimming, go ahead and trim it some more. And I'm using fine sandpaper here. You could use a medium and then a fine, whatever you need. So you want to work the sandpaper, sanding the outside rim and the inside rim as well. We're going to attach the inside rim, the outside rim, and the filler to the basket before lashing them on. Cable ties are in place, and I'll start with the inside rim. This is the end of the rim that I carved off the rounded side. So I'll just start it as I look at where the ears are, maybe here in this area, and I'll use a clothespin and just gently push it down inside the basket and place it in loosely in the notches, or down in like this. So that means my inside rim overlap will be here, and I want my outside rim to be on the same side of the basket, just following that inside rim overlap. And again, I'm going to start with the end that I carved away the rounded side, and I'll start my outside rim in this area. One clothespin, and just let it lay around the outside of the basket. Now I want to put my rim filler in, and I'll put its overlap somewhere in this general area from the inside rim overlap to the outside rim overlap. It goes through the notches in the ears. And I can just remove this clothespin and start that one. Now, once I get away from where my scarf joint is, that's the area where I will begin to tighten up the cable tie. Making sure that the filler fits right against that top edge through the ears, and that the inside and outside rims fit into the notches. Place the rims into the notches on this side and get that filler right through the center of the ear. I'm nearing the area where the rims are overlapped, so I just want to double check that indeed the carved surfaces are touching each other there before I buckle that down. Little helping hand there. Looks like I've lost that cable tie, so we'll just find one to put in there. All right. We have reached the final step, and now it's time to lash those rims onto your apple basket. To determine where you want to start the lashing, you need to locate your inside rim and your outside rim overlap and come over to the right of that to begin. I'll determine the smooth and the rough side of the lashing, and I want to place the lashing so that the smooth side is touching the basket on the inside, and I'm going to lay the slashing in a space and come up underneath the inside rim and underneath the rim filler. Maybe use a packing tool to help me do this. Once the end is anchored, I'll fold back a tab and slip this tab underneath the outside rim. So essentially this end is just up one side of the basket and down the other. And I'll leave this tab here as a marker of my start and cut it once I've lashed around completely one time. Just double check myself that my smooth side is out, and I'm ready to, keeping the smooth side up, feel all the way back to the end of my weaver. There are a couple of different approaches here. You can take your scissors and trim this end into a point. That makes it easier to slip through the space as you're lashing, or you can use some kind of a lashing tool, and I'm going to use this easy lash tool that's 4/4 inch wide material, so that just slips right into the end there. Here's the beginning tab, so the next space between spokes is my first space, and I insert that lashing underneath the rims and that top rim row. I pull an arm's length and bend the end around and into the next space. So here I'd like to have a loose loop of material and go again. Next space. Just continue with loops until I reach the ear. And I want to be sure that I'm bringing the lashing to the outside before I insert into the next space. This is the first half of an X or a cross stitch that happens right across the outside of that ear. All right. Now I have this long length or big loop on my left hand side here, and this is what becomes the first tight lashing stitch around my rim. So to make that happen, I reach to the inside with my right hand and I pull. Oftentimes this piece will flip, so I just want to straighten it out before I pull it on down. And before I tighten that stitch, I will push the rim filler down and pinch the inside and outside rims together, then tighten that stitch. Take this big loop and toss it over to the left to keep it out of my way. And I like to go ahead and clip this cable tie. Get it out of the way. In the same motion, because again that big loop becomes the next stitch that's tight around the rim. Straighten the piece out. What I'll do from now on is with every stitch, before I pull it down tight, I will reach in and retighten the previous stitch, pinching the rims together, pushing the rim filler down, and you can see that I'm actually laying that stitch diagonally across the end of the spoke. Big loop to the left. Make sure the piece is straight. Retighten the previous stitch. Push the filler down, pinch the rims together. So you can just get in a little zone with this. And the big loop to the left. retighten the previous stitch. And again, what you're seeing is some extra space in between these elements right there at the ear, and that's due to the thickness of that ear to where the notch is carved. Big loop to the left. Retighten the previous stitch and tighten the stitch that you're on. I want to check the handle placement now too, because oftentimes the ear is not straight in alignment with that spoke, and I just want to see where the handle rests on both sides of the basket before I tighten that down. Maybe do a little adjustment on the ear on the opposite side and check that swing again. And I'm kind of looking here at the space between the rim and the handle, or the position of the handle as it relates to the rim. So I'm happy with that. And now I'll tighten that on down. Big loop to the left. So I've reached the end of my lashing, and I'm going to repeat what I just did. I'm going to pull 1 arm's length out, bring this end around, and make some loose loops ahead. Being sure that I'm going under just that top wide rim row every time. I'm not catching any of the 1/4 inch weavers. Okay, and here we go again. I'm going to clip away the cable tie. My big loop is on the left. Retighten that previous stitch, placing the lashing stitch and tightening the stitch that I'm on. Now when this lashing gets a bit dry, I'm going to just spritz it. The part of the lashing that needs to stay wet is this piece here that's coming from the inside, and that is going to turn into that next wrap around the rim. So you don't necessarily have to re-wet the entire length, but I'd say 18-24 inches here is what you want to be sure that stays wet. And we're ready for another arm's length and some more loops ahead. as I continued to lash around, I reached this mark. And if you'll remember, that is where the last row of 1/4 inch was tapered off, and that tapered end was left on the inside of the basket. So this just reminded me to catch that end when my lashing stitch went right through that space. We'll come on around to the beginning. This is the tab where I started, and I've lashed to the stitch just before that. Trim that as close as I can. And I've got a bit of length on this weaver, so what I'm going to do is finish the first lashing. Turn and start in the opposite direction. As you tighten these stitches on the double lash, be sure that you pull them so they cross on the top edge above the rim filler. So we're simply lashing in the opposite direction. Go back and tighten. So it's about time to add a new lasher. I like to leave myself several inches of the old lasher here. Maybe I'll take one more stitch. And we'll get the new piece ready to add on. So this is my new piece of lashing, and I've soaked it. I might trim the edge of it just a bit on both sides. Just narrow it up slightly. And here's the last tightened stitch of the old lashing material. And I'm just going to lay these two pieces together and work my new piece up into that space a bit. And then pull both of those back down tight, so that my new end is caught up underneath that rim and up the other side just a bit. Okay. Now I'll move forward with my new end. And I'll be tightening that down 2 or 3 stitches. And I'll grab that lashing tool. A tight spot right there. Work that back a few stitches, and I'll go ahead and show you what we'll do at the handle since we're there. So here's the lashing going into one side of the ear, and I want to be sure and bring the lashing around to finish up that cross and insert it on the opposite side of the ear before I continue. So let's tighten up these stitches. That's the first one. And I'm keeping my big loop over to the right this time. Retighten that previous stitch. Tighten the stitch that we're on. This is like coming down the home stretch, almost. So we'll go back and finish off the initial lashing. We want it to be good and wet for us to work this. And I'm going to put the lashing tool on again. And I want to duplicate that first stitch that I made with the new lashing. And just align that as well as you can. Pull this down tight, and there are a number of ways of finishing this off. I'm going to show you how to do a lock stitch. So with the lock stitch, we want to get the end of this lashing down under a couple of rows of weaving. And I believe I'll trim this end and use my packing tool. So I'll go down under these top two rows. Just check to be sure that's really tight. So I've gone straight down. Then I'm going to fold this end up and tuck it over this row of weaving, under that row of weaving, and up under the rim. Before I tuck it, I'll just check to see what length that piece needs to be, probably about right there. And I'm going to cut the piece to length. And that locks that stitch in place. And this is the same way that you will finish off the end of the double lash. So I'm just finishing off the final piece of lashing. Getting ready to tuck it away here. And you can see a little bit of hairiness on the reed, and you can trim that inside and out with your scissors. Just take your time and do that. I'll do a little more trimming later. On the bottom, I like to sand off that last pencil mark. And on one of these spokes is a great place for you to sign your basket and put the date there. I really hope you've enjoyed the instruction. I thank you for joining us and made this lead to many more basket adventures for you.